Na, jetzt bin ich erstmal, ne? Nee. Ja, bei Jitsi. Ja. Okay. Hello, everyone. I welcome you to the opening lecture of Asking and Answering, Rivaling Approaches to Interrogative Methods. My name is Moritz, and before the lecture, I would like to say a few words. I hope this will not take very long. So first, some background. When this event was conceived, it was intended as an in-person event. Of course, COVID-19 appended those plans, like many other plans too. And in the early phase, like in March or April, we were still quite confident about doing something in person. But well, that might have been some optimism related to a famous quote that I wanted to get you acquainted with by a famous dead politician, Otto von Bismarck. If the world ends, then I will move to Mecklenburg because everything happens there 50 to 100 years later. And in some ways, the pandemic, I think, felt like a world ending to some of us. So maybe there's some reason for applying Bismarck's saying. So maybe on a side note, let me state briefly that Greifswald is not really located in Mecklenburg, but in another region, Vorpommern, and the two regions together make up the common state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is frequently referred to just by Mecklenburg. Anyway, so back to the background a little bit. So maybe it was a mistake to adhere to the in-person plan for so long, but in March, the lockdown regulations hit Greifswald as well as many other countries. And the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was actually not much affected by COVID-19 in terms of COVID-19 cases and deaths per capita. So we're in a very lucky situation. We are aware that at many places it was much worse than in Greifswald, and I think that is reason for explicitly appreciating everybody's participation and everyone involved, even so, especially since some of you have been affected much more than maybe the organizers here. So, and of course, another burden that basically all the speakers had to carry were like intensified when we switched to digital, because we came to a decision that we implement the use of pre-reads, and we also shortened the time of the presentation, and we extended the time of the discussion. So I would like to thank everyone who adjusted to these new terms, and it was clear that not everybody could adjust to the full amount to these terms. So I think we also have to thank those who are compromising on the length, on the text, and so on. That includes all the people who read the pre-reads. So anyway, this does not fully apply to today's lecture, because Ivano Ciardelli's lecture was always imagined to be like a traditional opening presentation, publicly accessible, and an address which kind of calls up a central issue of the conference. So it's kind of an evening lecture, except it's not evening in all the places where you are viewing from. So, but you can try to get into the mood. So maybe this brings me to one of the technicalities. All registered participants can attend this talk via Jitsi or YouTube. The remainder of the conference will be entirely on Jitsi. So maybe some of you who are watching from YouTube now, and who can only watch from YouTube now, are enticed by Ivano's talk and by the ensuing discussion to participate on Friday and Saturday too. So if so, do send me an email. We still have the capacity for a few more participants before we have to fear that the digital conference exceeds its technical limitations. But beyond this point, then maybe Bismarck's dictum may apply to the delays in the video and audio streams. But right now, at this point, it seems to work okay or even well. So the other presentations, to come to the content, the other presentations will address the asking of questions from a diverse points of view. And I think it will be our tasks in the discussions to find common ground. Yeah, common ground, that's maybe a term that we will hear a lot in the conference tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. I think where we mark some disagreement between different approaches, it would be interesting to find kind of yardsticks against which we can like assess a certain approach with regard to certain goal. At any rate, the organization and the preparation of the event was carried by a spirit that there's a mediation possible between the different approaches. You will see a lot of different approaches, and I think there's a lot of points where they can touch one another. So maybe for another minute, I will indulge in another little quote. It's actually a longer quote than the Bismarck quote in the beginning, but it's an abridged one. So here comes Jaco Hintecker commenting on the state of a conference on dialectics in 1978. At the pain of appearing hopelessly simple-minded, I cannot refrain from registering the serious problem I am experiencing here. We have not really located any unified phenomenon which could be termed dialectic and which could be compared with formal logic. For my own edification, I have tried to keep a list as if it were a score sheet of the different senses of dialectic, which have made their appearances in the discussions of the last couple of days. When the count recently exceeded 20, I began to worry. It seems to me that we should keep in mind in the remaining days of our program the desirability of finding some common factors in the different variants of the method of dialectic. Perhaps I may be allowed to formulate this desideratum in the form of a new Razor principle, attributing it to not Willy Ockham, but rather to Wilhelm Essler, the organizer of the conference. Dialectics must not be multiplied without necessity. Okay, so this little quote it's quite kind of related to what we're doing here. Dialectics, of course, is a topic different from questions, but I think it's in a clear vicinity, and both topics share presumed accessibility by means of formal logic, and as well as they have a basis in the informalities of like intuitively maneuvering everyday life. So both these aspects are important in the theory of questions too. But it's hard to treat both aspects with the same attention at the same time. So we see that in the pre-reads, I think. So one thing I want to take away from this quote in Hintecker's appeal is Hintecker's appeal to the desirability of finding common factors. However, in distinction from the context in which Hintecker spoke, I feel that there are much more touching points in the concrete contributions to our conference than there might have been at the Dialectics Conference in 1978. So that's from the point of view of having read the pre-reads, and I think you can agree with the knowledge of the pre-reads. So now let me come to the main point of today, which begins with the introduction of our very kind speaker, Ivano Cerdelli. So I will give a short stretch, short expose of his career, and then he will start with his talk. So I think it's important to point out that he started his philosophical ambitions in Bologna, but then spent most of his time in Amsterdam at the renowned Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation. There he received his master's degree, and in 2017, his PhD. In the same year, he was able to instantly switch to another renowned institute, namely the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, as assistant professor. As far as I know, last year he further qualified via an Italian habilitation. So we have with us an young aspiring scholar, if I may say so, in the best sense of these words, of course. Among his publications, I only want to draw attention to the monograph that he co-wrote with Jerion Groenendijk and Floris Rolofsen, the latter of whom will give a presentation on Saturday. The book is called Inquisitive Semantics, and it is available from Oxford University Press. Maybe at this point, I can briefly share the screen so that you can see that book actually. Wait a second. Here you go. So it's kind of an impressive front cover. So I hope that makes it attractive to take a look into it if you haven't already done so. So so that is the main publication, I would say, at least from the point of view of this conference. And Inquisitive Semantics is the project that was actually where actually Ivano is one of the main developers and one of the main researchers to be credited. So apart from the publications, Ivano was awarded with several scholarships relating to his meritorious scientific work, for example, from the Evert Willem Bett Foundation. He also got 2 awards for teaching skills, which make me kind of optimistic about what we will learn or how much we will learn from today's lecture. So I think with these words, I'm happy to cede the stage to you, Ivano, and we will hear your considerations about the foundational question of why we need a question semantics. Okay.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for the very kind introduction. So let me try to share the screen again. Application window. Okay, so now you should be able to see the slides, right?
Yeah, right.
Yes, and do you also see my mouse pointer?
Yes.
So I could use it to like highlight things. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So then let's start. So first, let me say that I'm very happy to participate in this event. So in these days of lockdown, one doesn't get many opportunities to have interesting conversations at all, let alone some nice conversations on formal approaches to questions. So I'm very much looking forward to these 3 days and some interaction with all of you. And of course, I'm grateful to Moritz for the invitation to give this evening talk. So this talk is a kind of follow-up to some discussions that I had with Moritz when he visited Munich last year. And of course, Moritz comes to the topic of questions from a very different angle from my own. So talking to him really pushed me to think more explicitly about the place of questions in a theory of language, whether it's natural language or formal logical language. And in this talk, I want to share some reflections on this issue. So the title of the talk is Why We Need a Question Semantics. And I intend this question in 2 ways. The first reading is for what purposes we need a question semantics. That is, what roles do we want a question semantics to play in an overall theory of language? And thinking about this will bring out some desiderata for a question semantics. And so hopefully it will also help to compare different approaches, which, as Moritz mentioned, is one of the aims of this event. Although the comparison itself will not be the focus of my talk today. And the second reading, I have in mind is why we need a question semantics and not just a question pragmatics. So this is related to the fact that in philosophy, there's a tradition going back to Frege of analyzing questions in terms of a certain kind of speech act, namely asking. And in this line, the difference between statements and questions is located at the level of force and not at the level of content. Right? So against this view, I want to argue that just like we distinguish a proposition from its assertion, it is important to distinguish a question content from its asking. And that's because questions play other important roles besides being asked, and we need contents that allow us to account for how they play these roles. So here's the plan for the talk. I will start by looking at the more familiar case of statements and asking what roles semantics plays in that case. And then I will argue that essentially the same roles are to be played by semantics in the case of questions. And I will use these observations to make a point about the importance of distinguishing questions from their asking. Then in the second part of the talk, I will briefly introduce the approach to question semantics that I favor, namely inquisitive semantics, as Moritz mentioned. And I will say something about how this approach can be put to work in the different roles that we identified above. So that's the plan. So let's start from statements. So what roles does semantics play in that case? And before starting, a terminological clarification. So here I will use the word statement to refer to a syntactic object, namely as a synonym of declarative clause. And I will use the word proposition for the content of a statement and assertion for the speech act, which is conventionally associated with statements. So in our theorizing about language, we use the semantic content of a statement in at least 4 roles. We use it to do compositional semantics. We use it to define logical relations, to analyze propositional attitudes, and to give accounts of how communication works. And I want to say something about each of these points. So start with compositional semantics. So as we know, one of the key features of human languages, both natural and artificial, is that they are recursive. They consist of discrete units, which are then assembled into larger units by means of grammatical rules. Right? And compositional semantics is concerned with how the semantic value of a complex expression is built up recursively from the semantic values of its constituents. Now, in particular, statements don't just occur as the final output of the compositional process, but they also occur embedded, that is, as components of other sentences. For instance, the statement Smith stole the jewels also occurs as a component of the sentences. If Smith stole the jewels, he's out of the country by now. Or Alice knows that Smith stole the jewels. Now, when a statement occurs embedded, as here, then its semantics plays a role in determining the semantics of the larger sentence. So one role for the content of a statement is internally to compositional semantics as an input to the process of semantic composition. Next, consider logic. So in logic, we study relations between statements like entailment and consistency. And one of the key roles of semantics is to characterize what these relations amount to. That is, what it means for a statement to be a logical consequence of another, what it means for 2 statements to be consistent, and so on. And moreover, logic deals with certain linguistic items that we think of as logical items, like connectives and quantifiers. And of course, we want to use semantics to characterize the contribution that these logical items make to a complex sentence. Now, a third role has to do with propositional attitudes. So the mental life of an agent like ourselves is characterized by a variety of states, such as beliefs, credence, which is the graded version of belief, desire, hope, etc., which are commonly called propositional attitudes. Now, compare two kinds of attitudes that Bob might have. Let's say Bob admires Alice, and Bob hopes that Alice called. Now, if I ask, what is the object of Bob's admiration? Well, that's easy. It's Alice, right? It's a concrete object in the world. But what is the object of Bob's hope? Right? That is more tricky. The object of Bob's hope is something more abstract, which seems to be an object that represents a state of affairs, right? An object that represents Alice as having called. Now, what we can say is that given the structure of the sentence that expresses this state of Bob, the object of Bob's hope is whatever is denoted here by the complement that Alice called, right? So presumably it's nothing but the proposition expressed by the statement Alice called. So the objects expressed by statements are not just objects of speech, but they are also the kind of things that play a role in our mental life as contents of beliefs, hopes, suspicions, etc. And finally, of course, such contents also play a role in the process of communication. Now, conventionally, statements are associated with the act of assertion. If I just tell you, Smith stole the jewels, then that counts as me asserting that Smith stole the jewels. But they are also involved in other speech acts. For instance, I could say, let's say Smith stole the jewels, or hopefully Smith stole the jewels. Now, these speech acts are also actions whereby I'm doing something which is about the content of the sentence Smith stole the jewels, but the something that I'm doing is something different than asserting this content. So we want an account of how assertion and these other speech acts work, for instance, in terms of their preconditions and effects. And such accounts are bound to refer to the semantic content of the statement. For instance, a typical account of assertion might say that the speaker tries to get this content accepted by the conversational participants, or that the speaker undertakes a commitment to this content, or something like that. So in any case, the content expressed plays a crucial role as part of the explanation of how the speech act works. So in a diagram, we could summarize the situation like this. So the content of a statement plays a role, so it's built up compositionally, and it plays a role internally to compositional semantics itself when the statement occurs embedded, and externally to compositional semantics. This feeds into logic, where it's used, for instance, to define the notion of entailment, into philosophy of mind, where it's used to pin down what is the content of attitudes like belief, and in pragmatics, where it's used to give account of speech acts like assertion. Now, concretely, in the case of statements, what is the formal notion of content which is used in theorizing? Now, of course, there are different approaches, but the most standard one is the approach given by intentional truth conditional semantics. And for simplicity, I will only sketch the most basic version, a la Montague, and setting aside important refinements which are needed to deal with issues like context dependency, presuppositions, etc. Now, in standard intentional semantics, a model comes with an associated set of possible words which represent different states of affairs, right? And then for statements, what the semantics recursively builds up are truth conditions with respect to words, right? So what we get from the semantics is a relation of truth that connects possible words to statements. And then the proposition expressed by a statement can be identified, and it's usually identified with the set of words where the statement is true. And I'm going to denote this set like this by means of these vertical bars. So this kind of truth conditional content is what compositional semantics builds up. And then these truth conditional contents are put to use to ground logic, for instance, defining entailment as preservation of truth, defining connectives as truth functions, etc. It's put to use to model attitudes, as think, for instance, of the Hintican account of knowledge and belief in intentional semantics. And it's put to use to formulate theories of speech acts. For instance, both Stolnaker's account of assertion or several commitment-based accounts, like the one of Manfred Krivka, who is here, are formulated in terms of the intentional semantics notion of content. So, are you still hearing fine? Because so Jitsi tells me that my microphone appears to be noisy. I don't know if this is the case.
No, but we can hear you good. Yeah.
Okay, well, I will just carry on and ignore this. All right. So now that we have refreshed the case of statements, let us turn to the topic of our inquiry, namely questions. And again, let me start by terminological clarification, because the word question is used in several different ways. So as for the case of statements, I will use the word question for a syntactic object, namely as a synonym of interrogative clause. And I will use the word issue for the semantic content of a question. And I will use the word asking act for the speech act, which is conventionally associated with a question. So what roles are there for question contents to play? Now, my claim that I want to argue is that these are the same that we just identified for propositions, at least. Meaning there might be others, but at least we want question contents to play these roles. So start from compositional semantics. So just like statements, questions can occur as parts of other sentences. And here are some examples. If Alice leaves, where will she go? So here we have a question, where will she go? Which is part of a larger conditional construction, which is itself a question. Or whether I will go hiking depends on what the weather is like. So here we have two questions which are part of a statement which asserts a certain relation between them. And Alice knows who stole the jewels. So here we have a question, who stole the jewels, which occurs as an argument of a knowledge ascription. So even if we were just interested in associating statements with truth conditions, which of course we shouldn't be, we still need question meanings as inputs to the composition process to derive the truth conditions of statements like 7 and 8 here. Next, just like statements, questions participate in interesting logical relations. So to illustrate this point, imagine that we have a 2-digit code where each digit is either 1, 2, or 3, right? So we have 9 possible codes, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and so on. Now, it's natural to say that the statement, the code is 1, 1, or 1, 2, implies the statement, the first digit is 1. So this is the kind of relation that we're normally concerned with in logic. But it's also natural to say that the statement, the code is 1, 1, or 1, 2, resolves the question, what is the first digit? Right? And I'm going to refer to this relation as logical resolution. And there's also a natural sense in which the question, what is the code, determines the question, what is the first digit? Right? If you so if you have the information what the code is, then you have the information what the first digit is. And I will refer to this relation between questions as logical dependency. Now, logical resolution and logical dependency are pretty interesting logical notions. For instance, if I had more time, I would argue that dependency is tightly connected to the notion of predictive power of a scientific theory, as well as to the philosophical concept of supervenience. So it's really a kind of logical pattern that is at the heart of some interesting scientific and philosophical notions. And one thing that we'd like a question semantics to do is to characterize precisely what these relations amount to, and to allow us to develop formal systems, as we usually do in logic, that we can use to study the properties of these notions and to regiment reasoning about them. Now, next, turn to the third role, attitudes. So we talked about propositional attitudes, which are mental states whose content is a proposition. But there are also mental states and activities which we might naturally call question-directed. So for instance, we could say that Alice is curious about who stole the jewels, or doesn't care who stole the jewels, or has an opinion about who stole the jewels. So these are 3 mental states that Alice might be in. And there are also activities like Alice is investigating who stole the jewels, or Alice argued with Bob about who stole the jewels. Right? Now we can ask, what is the object of these states and activities? Now, I think that intuitively, whereas a proposition is something that represents a definite state of affairs, the object which is at play here is something that represents not one, but a multiple alternative states of affairs. Now, whether that's right or not, what we can say is that compositionally, this object is something that is supplied in the structure of the sentence by the interrogative clause, who stole the jewels. So presumably it's nothing but the issue expressed by the question, who stole the jewels. And we can strengthen this point by looking at data about anaphora. For instance, a speaker says, who stole the jewels? And another speaker says, I'm investigating that. So the that presumably picks up the content expressed by the question and claims that that is what the speaker is investigating. So this shows that much like propositions, issues are not just objects of speech, but they're also the kind of objects that play a role in our mental life as things that we take interest in, that we investigate, that we form opinions about, or that we choose to disregard, and so on. So they seem to play quite important cognitive role as well. And finally, of course, question contents play a major role in communication. So questions are by default associated with the act of asking. So if I just tell you, who stole the jewels? Then normally that counts as me asking the question. But just like statements, they can be involved in other speech acts too, right? And I want to give two examples. The first one is one that I like. So in Italian, I can say, chissà chi ha rubato I gioielli. So that's something that I would translate in English as, I wonder who stole the jewels. But it's clear in Italian that what I'm doing here is not to make an assertion about my own state, because the Italian sentence is not even a declarative sentence, and it's not even about me, right? So if I say this, if I say, chissà chi ha rubato I gioielli, what I'm doing is just voicing my wondering about this issue. But I'm not asking who stole the jewels. In fact, that's typically the kind of thing that you would say in a conversation where it's presupposed that the question cannot be settled in the current conversation. And for another example, we can, of course, also say things like, let's set aside who stole the jewels. Let's focus on how they broke in, something like this. So when you say that, you're in a way aiming to change the conversational status of the issue, who stole the jewels. And again, so you're doing something with this issue, but this something is not asking the issue. So like propositions, issues provide the content for different speech acts. And we want to use question semantics in an account of how these speech acts work. So to summarize, propositions and issues have largely, I think, the same roles to play. We want to use them internally to compositional semantics to deal with the contribution of embedded statements and questions. We want to use them in logic to characterize notions like entailment and logical dependence. In philosophy of mind, as objects of attitudes like belief and wondering. And in pragmatics, as part of an account of speech acts like asserting and asking. And I would like to suggest that a satisfactory theory of question semantics should be able to play at least these roles. Now that takes me to the next part of the talk, which is the importance of distinguishing questions from asking. Now the picture that I sketched is one where statements and questions are sentences of different syntactic categories. They are associated with different semantic contents, propositions and issues, and with a default force, namely asserting versus asking. But there's an alternative view that goes back to Frege, which was taken up again in the literature, for instance, by Searle and van der Weyken, according to which statements and questions are not distinguished at the semantic level, where they both express propositions, but only at the level of force. So in particular, a question is something that presents a propositional content with an asking force. Now, there's a well-known problem with this view, which was noticed immediately by Frege himself, and that is that the idea that the content of a question is a proposition may perhaps work for yes-no questions, like, will you go to France? But it just seems like a non-starter for many other kinds of questions. For instance, Will you go to France, Italy, or Spain? Or where will you go? Or if you win a free trip, where will you go? So in all these cases, the question is not asking to confirm or deny a specific proposition, and it seems quite clear that there's no way to tie questions like 14b, c, and d to just one specific proposition. So that means that at the very least, there is more work to do to specify in general what the content of a question is going to be. Now, I want to focus, so this is an important problem, but I want to focus on a somewhat different problem. Now, on this view, questions are really distinguished only at the speech act level, right? So the contribution of the interrogative form lies specifically in signaling the asking force. However, in light of what we've seen so far, it seems like a bad idea to tie questions so directly to the act of asking. And that's because, like propositions play many other roles besides being asserted, question contents play many other roles besides being asked. And let me just rehearse this point by going through some observations again. So first, compositionality. So like propositions, question contents play a role in compositional semantics. So when I say Alice knows whether it's raining, the embedded question whether it's raining is making a specific compositional contribution here. This contribution is different from the one of the embedded statement that it's raining, but the difference is not has not to do with an act of asking, because there's no asking force involved here, right? Nothing gets asked. Rather, the interrogative embedded clause just plays a role in giving a description of what Alice's knowledge state is like. Second point, we looked at attitudes. So we've seen that, like propositions, question contents are not just objects of speech, but they're also just objects of thought. So for instance, if I'm investigating whether it's raining, then whether it's raining picks up the thing that I'm investigating, right? But the object of my investigation is not an asking act, is not some kind of conversational move. In fact, for me to be investigating whether it's raining, there doesn't have to be any conversation around at all, right? So what I'm investigating is just how things are with respect to a certain issue. And finally, we've seen that, like propositions, question contents are not just tied to a single speech act. They are not, so just like propositions are not exclusively tied to asserting, question contents are not exclusively tied to asking. So again, I can say, I wonder whether it's raining, and or let's set aside whether it's raining, which are discourse moves that somehow involve the question whether it's raining, but not the asking of this question. So the point that I want to make is that question contents, the kind of things that I'm calling issues, bear exactly the same relation to asking that propositions bear to asserting. So they are indeed the things that we ask. They provide the contents of asking acts, but they also have a life independent of asking. They play a role in compositional semantics. They play a role in logic, in thought, and in speech acts other than asking. So just like it's important to distinguish propositions from their assertion, it's important to distinguish issues from their asking. And about this, I would like to quote a very nice passage from Belknap on the declarative fallacy. So the declarative fallacy in Belknap's terminology is the idea that declarative language is the model of all language, and that therefore declarative contents, namely propositions, should be somehow the prototype of all contents. And he's commenting on a passage by Searle and van der Weyken on speech act theory. And he says, I understand that there are many speech acts that share a propositional content but differ in illocutionary force. Good. And there are many other speech acts that share an interrogative content but differ in illocutionary force, and others that share an imperative content but differ in illocutionary force. So the program of speech act theory is a healthy one. The only but serious mistake is to suppose that you can identify the content of all speech acts with propositional content, that is, with the content of declarative speech acts. And then he goes on, and then he says, avoiding the declarative fallacy requires the recognition that interrogatives and imperatives are not just marked differently from declaratives, but possess fundamentally different underlying content structures. So the picture that he's inviting us to think about is something like this. So we have propositions. These are the things that are contents of statements, and they are the things that can be asserted or supposed or hopefully asserted or what have you. And then we have issues, which are contents of questions, and these are the things that can be asked, that can be wondered aloud, that can be set aside, and so on. And I think this is indeed a reasonable picture to have in mind. Now, let me come to the second part of the talk. So in this second part, I want to briefly introduce the kind of approach to question semantics that I favor, namely inquisitive semantics, and then say something about how inquisitive semantics deals with the four roles that I described. Now, the key idea of the approach is actually quite simple for the case of questions. We can put it like this. So to understand a question is to know what information it takes to resolve it. So you understand the question if you know what kind of information must be available in order for the question to be resolved. So the analogy to have in mind is that what truth conditions are for statements, resolution conditions are for questions. Now, the objects relative to which we evaluate truth conditions in intentional semantics are possible worlds in a model. What are the objects relative to which a question may be said to be resolved or not? Well, they are bodies of information, which we call information states. Right? The idea is that the kind of question that is meaningful to ask is, given such and such information, is the question then resolved? Now, for the purposes of having a formal semantics, we want to have a precise notion of information states. And so we want to model them in a specific way. Now, within the framework of intentional semantics, it's natural to model an information state as a set of possible words. And the idea is that the words in the set are those words which are compatible with the information available in the state. So the more information you have, the less words will be compatible with it, and so the smaller your state will get. Right? So semantics is given then by a relation that we call support between information states and questions, where information states are modeled as sets of possible words. And the idea is that this is the relation which holds in case the information available in the state resolves the question. Now, just like in intentional semantics, we identify the content of a statement with the set of words where it is true. Here we can identify the content of a question with the set of information states where it is supported. So we call this the issue expressed by the question, and we denote this set by means of these square brackets here. Now, another notion which is useful to have around is the notion of alternatives. So the alternatives for a question are the maximal states in terms of inclusion that support the question. So they are those states such that the question is resolved in these states, and there is no weaker state where the question is also resolved. Okay. Now, let me illustrate these ideas with some examples. So let's consider again our code scenario, right? So we have 9 possible codes, which are 2 digits, where each digit is between 1 and 3. Now let's consider 3 different questions. First, is the first digit 1? Now, in order to resolve this question, we must either have the information that the first digit is 1, or we need the information that the first digit is not 1. Right? So to have the information that the first digit is 1 means that we're able to locate the code within this area of the logical space. So this means that we are in an information state which is a subset of the first row. And to have the information that the first digit is not 1 means that we're able to locate the code in this part of the logical space, right? So the second and the third row. So the largest states where the question is resolved are exactly the 2 blocks depicted here. So these are the alternatives for the question. And then the issue expressed by the question consists of these 2 states and all of their subsets. Similarly, take the question, what is the first digit, right? To resolve this question, we need either the information that the first digit is 1, or the information that the first digit is 2, or the information that the first digit is 3. So that means we need to be in a state which is a subset of one of the rows. So the maximal states where the question is resolved are the 3 rows themselves. And the issue consists of these 3 blocks plus all of their subsets. And finally, take the question, what is the code? Well, in this case, the question is only resolved if we can pinpoint exactly which of these words is the actual one. So in this case, the alternatives for the question are exactly the singletons. So I hope this makes good intuitive sense. Now, in principle, we could just use this approach as a semantics of questions. However, in inquisitive semantics, we also take a further step, namely, once this support semantics is in place, it's also natural to use it for statements as well. So the idea there is that it's natural to view an information state as supporting a statement if the information which is available implies that the statement is true, right? So for instance, take the statement, the first digit is 1. Now, when will this be supported by an information state? Well, it must be a state which implies that the first digit is indeed 1. So it should be a state that locates the code within the top row. So this will be supported by a state just in case this state is a subset of the proposition expressed by this statement. And this is the general pattern. So in the case of statements, there will be a systematic connection between support conditions and truth conditions. Namely, a state will support a statement alpha just in case it's a subset of the proposition expressed by alpha. And that means that with a statement, we can associate not just a standard proposition, a set of words, but also an inquisitive content, namely the set of those information states which are subsets of that proposition. So that means that statements and questions will express contents which are different, because in the case of statements, we will have a single alternative, a single maximal supporting states. And in the case of questions, in general, we will have multiple alternatives, but which are of the same semantic type. Namely, both of them are sets of information states, and that gives a uniformity which is actually useful at different points in the theory, as I hope to illustrate in a moment. So this was a very quick introduction to the ideas of inquisitive semantics. Now let's see these ideas in action with respect to the roles that we discussed in the previous part of the talk. So start from compositional semantics. Now, of course, we cannot examine here all kinds of environments where questions embed. So I will just illustrate the usefulness of the approach with one example of embedding context, namely conditionals. Now, theories of conditionals are normally formulated in terms of truth conditions. And because of that, they are restricted to conditional statements, like if the first digit is 1, the second is 3. But there are also conditional questions, like if the first digit is 1, what is the second? And in the end, we would like to have a theory of what the conditional construction is contributing, which explains what the conditional is doing across both cases. Now, inquisitive semantics allows for a unified account of conditional statements and questions, which is based on a very natural idea, which is at the heart of much theorizing on conditionals. And that is the Ramsey test idea. So the Ramsey test idea is the idea that to assess a conditional, if A then C, we proceed in 2 steps. First, we suppose the antecedent entering a certain hypothetical state, and then in this hypothetical state, we assess the consequent. Right? This is psychologically extremely plausible, and in inquisitive semantics, this idea can be turned directdirectly into a semantic clause for the conditional. So we can say that to assess if a conditional, if A then C is supported, we proceed in 2 steps. First, we suppose the antecedent, which means we restrict the information state to those words where the antecedent is true. And then we check whether in this hypothetical information state, the consequent C is supported. So this is just a direct reflection of the idea of the Ramsey test. Now, 2 remarks here. First, note that this is a uniform account because here C can be a statement or a question. This is because we exploit the fact that both are interpretable in terms of support. So whether C is a statement or a question, this relation is going to make sense. And second, the account also exploits the fact that the semantics is based on information states, since an information state is exactly the right kind of object to be affected by a supposition. Right? Supposition is an operation that takes an information state to another information state. Now, to show the results of this clause, here are the predictions for our two conditionals. For the statement, if the first digit is 1, the second is 3, we get a single alternative that coincides with the proposition expressed by the standard material conditional. And for the question, if the first digit is 1, what is the second? So there we get 3 alternatives corresponding to the statements. If the first digit is 1, then the second digit is also 1. If the first digit is 1, the second digit is 2. And if the first digit is 1, then the second digit is 3. So in other words, we predict that a conditional question is a question that asks to resolve the consequent, but so in this case, resolve the question, what is the second digit, but only under the assumption that the first digit is 1. So only relative to the part of the logical space where the antecedent is satisfied, which seems like the right prediction. So note that this extends easily to counterfactuals, or if you'd like to other accounts of indicatives, just by varying the relevant account of how we make a supposition. So the upshot here is that we get a more general account of the conditional construction beyond the declarative case, which is not just a hack, it's motivated by a very natural idea, namely the Ramsey test. And this account exploits some central features of inquisitive semantics, namely the fact that evaluation takes place relative to information states, and the fact that we have a uniform semantics for statements and questions. So that was an illustration of, let's say, the benefits of the account with respect to compositional semantics. Next, consider logic. So since the semantics is given in terms of support conditions, entailment is naturally defined in terms of preservation of support. So phi will entail psi, just in case whenever phi is supported, psi is supported as well. So this is just the obvious notion of entailment that comes with the semantics. Now, what does this relation amount to? Now, if we look at the special case in which the formulas that we consider are statements, then the connection between truth and support ensures that entailment will coincide with standard truth conditional entailment. So as usual, we will have that the code is 1, entails that the first digit is 1, and the first digit is 1 entails that the code contains a 1. So we retrieve standard entailment of classical logic as a special case. Now, if we look at the case of questions, then what entailment captures is precisely the notion of logical dependency that I mentioned before. So for instance, the question, what the code is, determines what the first digit is, and what the first digit is determines whether the first digit is 1. Right? And these are indeed captured as cases of the relation of entailment between questions. And finally, if we look at entailments from statements to questions, then this captures the notion of resolution that we mentioned. So for instance, the statement that the first digit is 2 logically resolves the question whether the first digit is 1, and this indeed comes out as a case of logical entailment. So the semantics comes with a natural notion of entailment, which is a conservative extension of the standard notion beyond statements. And logical relations involving questions like dependency and resolution emerge as cases of this general notion of entailment. Moreover, entailment in turn determines uniquely a natural treatment of logical operations, namely connectives and quantifiers, which is motivated by algebraic considerations. And this means that we get for free, meaning without having to make any special stipulations, certain well-behaved logical systems which comprise both statements and questions. So for an illustration, take a first-order inquisitive logic. So this is a logical system where we have standard first-order formulas which receive the usual reading. For instance, this formula for all x, px if and only if not qx is read as usual as saying that q is the complement of p. But we also have some new formulas which are read as questions. For instance, this formula for all x whether px expresses the question which objects are p. And similarly, this question expresses, so this formula expresses the question which objects are q. And here's an example of a logical validity. So if p is the complement of q, then the extension of p determines the extension of q, right? This is something which is clearly true, and this amounts exactly to the validity of this dependency. So if p is the complement of q, then the question which objects are p determines the question which objects are q, right? So we capture quite interesting logical notions, logical relations as cases of entailment. Moreover, because these dependencies are cases of entailment, they can also be proved by means, for instance, of pretty standard natural deduction proofs. And here is an example of a proof of the dependency that I just showed. Now, I don't have much time to go into it because I'm around the end of the time, but I just want to point out that this is a proof where we have a question assumption and a question conclusion, but everything proceeds quite standardly. So for instance, the universal quantifier gets introduced and eliminated in the standard ways, no matter whether it occurs in a question like here or in a statement like here. And the same is true of the other logical operations. So we can really do quite proper logic in these systems. So the upshot is that we get a simple foundation for the logic of questions that makes it contiguous with the logic of statements and very much intertwined with it. And notice that, again, this result exploits some of the key features of the approach. One is the fact that the semantics is based on a satisfaction relation, which is exactly what is preserved by entailment, right? So in this respect, the semantics is quite similar to truth conditional semantics and quite different from some other approaches to question semantics, like answer set semantics. And second, of course, the fact that statements and questions can be interpreted uniformly, which allows them to stand easily in logical relation to each other. Now, very quickly, because I'm almost done. So attitudes. So if we say that Alice wonders or doesn't care what the first digit is, we can take these attitudes, we can take these to be attitudes towards the issue expressed by the question, what is the first digit? And we can also do something more, namely, just like in the Hintican tradition, we use sets of words to model the knowledge state of an agent. So in a similar vein, we can use issues to model the inquisitive state of an agent in a way that reflects both what the agent knows and what the agent is curious about. So for instance, this could be the states of two agents with the same knowledge but different interests. Let's say in both cases, what the agent knows is that the first digit is 1, but the first agent is also interested in what the second digit is, whereas the second agent is indifferent to that. They don't care. And by using this notion of inquisitive state of an agent, we can provide a formal analysis of wandering, which is very much in the spirit of the Hintican analysis of knowledge and belief, and which accounts, for instance, for inferences like this. Alice knows that the code is 11 or 12. Alice wonders what the code is. Therefore, Alice wonders whether the code is 11 or 12, which seems like a good prediction. So the upshot here is that we can use the question contents that we have both as objects of question-directed attitudes and also in order to give a formal analysis of such attitudes in the spirit of epistemic logic. And lastly, discourse, just super quickly. So here the only point that I want to make is that the fact that issues don't bake in an asking force makes them suitable as contents for a variety of speech acts. For instance, just for the sake of illustration, we could give the following accounts of asking versus wondering aloud. We could say that by performing the act ask Q, a speaker commits to believing the union of the issue, which is the presupposition of the question, and then requests the addressee to commit to some piece of information that resolves the question. Whereas by performing an action of wondering aloud, Q, a speaker still commits in believing the presupposition of the question, but moreover, they commit to being in a state of wondering about the question. They commit to having a certain interest, but crucially, they don't make any request on the addressee. Right? So in both cases, the speaker is doing something with the issue expressed by the question Q, in the first case, requesting a resolution, and in the second case, expressing their wondering, we could say. All right, so I'm out of time, so let me conclude. So in the first part of the talk, I argued that contents of statements and questions play largely parallel roles. They participate in the process of meaning composition. They stand in logical relations to one another, and they can be combined by logical operations. They play a role in our mental life as contents of our thoughts and activities. And they play a role in discourse, providing contents for a range of speech acts. And a desideratum for theories of question semantics is that they account for these different roles. Now, there's a line of thought that interprets questions at the discourse level as asking acts, but some of these roles, the first three, don't involve discourse at all, or the last case, they involve discourse, but not asking, but some other speech. And so I think that the content force distinction seems as relevant for questions as it is rightly taken to be for statements. Then in the second part of the talk, we looked at a recent approach to questions, namely inquisitive semantics. This approach interprets statements and questions uniformly in terms of a relation of support relative to an information state. For questions, this amounts to a specification of resolution conditions. Now that means that statements and questions still express different semantic objects, but the difference is not one of semantic type. And finally, we discussed how inquisitive semantics can be put to use in the 4 roles that we identified. In compositional semantics, I've argued that it facilitates uniform theories of environments which embed both statements and questions. And I have illustrated this with conditionals, but this holds more generally, of course. In logic, it yields a more general perspective on the notion of entailment, which covers also the notions of resolution and dependency. It can be put to use to give formal theories of question-directed attitudes, like wondering. And finally, since these contents are force-neutral, they lend themselves to an account of different interrogative speech acts. So thank you very much for your attention. And here are 2 great reads on these topics that I highly recommend. One is Belknap's paper that I also quoted from, and the other is a handbook article by Groenendijk and Stockhoff. So I will end here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ivano. I think we have to skip on the applause, but thank you for this very interesting lecture. And we are now starting the discussion. For that, please keep in mind that we also have a YouTube part, and the viewers at YouTube can actually participate in the discussion, provided they have a YouTube account. They can type in a question in the chat that is attached to the stream. For the Jitsi participants, please use the hand raising button, which is to the bottom left. I'm trying to point to it. Maybe this works. And then we can see who has some questions. So for now, I see that Manfred wants to ask something. Please go ahead, Manfred.
Yes, hello. Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk. I will have to apologize because I'm at another conference in Philadelphia too, so I have to leave pretty soon. Very interesting. I have one question, namely about the distinction between embedded questions and non-embedded questions, because there is a syntactic distinction in many languages. So in English, for example, you can ask what is the second digit, but not John knows what is the second digit. You say John knows what the second digit is. Now, this seems to be a subtle syntactic distinction, but after all, it turns out that sometimes you have embedded questions with this root syntax, like you can say, I wonder what is the second digit. In many varieties of English, and it is actually quite normal. And so this distinction actually can be taken as saying that if you ask a question, you use the root syntax, the main clause syntax of a question, and there is some semantic element that takes something like a inquisitive meaning and changes it to a speech act. So the inquisitive meaning itself is not quite a speech act yet. There must be something in addition that makes it a question as asked in conversation. And it's interesting that, for example, with the conditional clauses, you have this root clause syntax as well. So I was wondering whether you consider this distinction between embedded questions and non-embedded questions something that is relevant in your thinking.
Yes, so thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, good. Yes, indeed. So I'm actually quite sympathetic to the idea that, that let's say, at the level of the root question, there is somehow an inner component that just gives the force neutral meaning, and then that also part of the syntax, there is something that indeed provides the force. So that would be perfectly compatible with the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make is that, let's say, at this more core level, we want to have this force neutral content. And the fact that this is shared between the embedded and non-embedded questions can be shown, for instance, well, I had something on this. Let me see if I can pick it up. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. So, for instance, we could consider dialogues like this. So Alice says, "Is it raining?" And then Bob says, "What Alice asked is whether it's raining," right? So it seems clear that the embedded clause, whether it's raining, is somehow reporting the content of what Alice is asking, right? So the root clause, "Is it raining?" As you mentioned, might indeed have also a syntactic element in it that provides the force, but it also has this more neutral content that can be picked up by the embedded version of the question. And similarly, here we have a dialogue. Let's say Alice says, "Is it raining?" And Bob says, "I'd like to know that," right? So this "that" kind of picks up the content of the question that Alice asked, but it could be substituted by an embedded question, "I'd like to know whether it's raining," right? So there is definitely, I think, an identity in content, but then in addition to this content, in the root version, there may well be something extra, which is what you suggested.
Okay, thank you. David. We can't hear you. David, maybe the microphone is off. All right. I don't know what the microphone is still turned off. Maybe we just take Jared for now. Jared, do you want to say something?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Bruno, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I had a question that I think will probably be posed to all of us at some point, but it's the claim that to understand a question is to know what could resolve it, right? Or what could answer it. I know, like, Jonathan Ginsberg way back posed some challenges to this thought, giving examples of asking questions about how to say a certain word in a language you didn't even know the syntax of. But more recently, Jane Friedman's done a lot of work in epistemology and has developed accounts of question-directed attitudes. And she's also made this point that she thinks that it's often the case that we understand questions and can even felicitously ask questions for which we have no idea what the answer would be. And I just want to know how do you deal with that seeming datum?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's indeed a very good point. I have to admit, it is indeed something to be thought more about. I feel like I don't have a great answer. But so something that does play a role, I think, is the fact that so the resolution conditions, let's say, they could be also encoded in a kind of opaque way, right? So that, let's say, you know, like, what is the condition that some piece of information would have to satisfy in order to count as a resolution, but you don't know what the possible pieces of information that might possibly qualify are, right? So it's hard to make this distinction formal in this possible world framework that we have, but I think maybe in a more refined modeling, one could try to bring that out, right? So I could know what it takes to resolve the question in terms of knowing a kind of test that a piece of information would have to pass in order to qualify, even though I have no idea what the candidate pieces of information are, right? So that might be a way to try to address it.
Good, thank you, thank you.
All right, so maybe we try it again with David. David, the microphone.
Okay,
microphone. Yes, now we hear you. Yes.
And maybe you can even see me. And I'm trying to get myself seen, but it doesn't seem to work. I had a question about your proposed
David,
terminology.
David, sorry, you just have to. Oh
Yes.
yeah, now we can see you. Okay, all right.
Okay, I'm now visible, which I like. The word question for the string of marks or sounds in written English, typically ending with a question mark. The word issue for the semantic content of such a thing, and the word asking for the one of the speech acts that you can perform by uttering or writing one of the strings. And think it's better than what there was in the article by Grondendijk and Stockhoff that you cited at the end. They used the terminology of interrogatives, interrogative acts, and questions for the content. And I think this is a bit confusing. So I prefer your terminology, but I guess if I have a question, it's what other terminologies there are around, and whether yours is adopted by other people, and what the prospects are for this becoming a common terminology.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. So indeed, we did choose to depart from the terminology that Grondendijk and Stockhoff had, right? So they used question for the semantic object and interrogative act for the speech act. Yeah, mostly because very often you want to talk about questions, say really at the level of sentences. And so we introduced this new word, issue, which to me is quite appealing for the semantic object, but I don't know whether or not it works for other people. So far, I think this is, let's say, a new terminological contribution of inquisitive semantics, but I hope it gets picked up more widely. And we also use inquisitive proposition for as a more general umbrella term for these kind of meanings at the inquisitive level, or these kind of contents at the inquisitive level, which include the things expressed by questions, and also the things expressed by statements at the higher level. But yeah, I don't know whether there will be a convergence on this terminological choice or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I think we now have a question from Catherine Handleby from YouTube. Hi there, I'm wondering if this semantics depends on there being a closed set of possible answers to the questions, as in the keypad. Would it work for interdeterminate possible answers?
Maybe what was meant is underdetermined, I guess.
It's interdeterminate. I don't know. Oh, indeterminate, probably.
Or indeterminate, something like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the semantics is designed to work not just for when there is like a fixed set of answers that can be specified a priori, but also for the case of open questions that contain a WH element, like who or what. In that case, the way the semantics works is similar to the way quantifiers are interpreted in first-order logic. Right? So in first-order logic, if you have a quantifier like everything or something, then that quantifier quantifies over a domain which is not given by the sentence, but it's given by the model that you're considering. And similarly here, these WH questions would be represented in a first-order framework where you have variables quantifying over a domain. So you would have something like, for what value of x does phi of x hold, right? So in this case, the form of the question doesn't prejudge, let's say, what the possible answers are, but rather the ways to resolve the question will be determined only when you look at this sentence in the particular context of a model where you have a well-defined domain of individuals that these WH words range over. Right? So this is the strategy that we have to deal with these open questions. Although, of course, here for the sake of presentation, I looked at cases where the domain of individuals is fixed and finite. But that's just for the sake of simplicity.
Okay, I just read a thank you by Catherine. So I think she's satisfied with the answer. And next is Andrew. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for the lecture. An inspiring one. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, you use the notion of resolution, that something resolves a question, and so on. What is the difference between that something resolves a question and something answers a question, between a resolution and an answer in your framework?
Yeah, so it would be fine to use, I think, the verb answers as an alternative to results. I think, yeah, to me, that would be equivalent. But so what is not equivalent, let's say, is to have, let's say, this approach as opposed to a semantics which primarily specifies what the answers are, unless the answers are like specifically construed as just bodies of information that resolve the questions, right? But usually answer set frameworks take as primitive a notion of answer which builds in more constraint than that. So not everything that resolves the question is considered a basic answer. And one of the things that we find problematic about such frameworks is that often it's not clear what these further criteria are in order to qualify as an answer, right? I have an example at some point. Let me see. So, yeah, so for instance, take a question like who passed the exam, right? And then take the propositions corresponding to these three statements. Alice passed the exam, nobody passed the exam, and only Alice and Bob passed the exam. Now, in principle, you might call each of these propositions maybe a possible answer. But so for Hemblin and Kartunen, only a proposition like Alice passed the exam qualifies as a basic answer, but it's not clear on what conceptual grounds the distinction is made. And I think this is particularly puzzling if one notes that the proposition that Alice passed the exam doesn't resolve the question who passed the exam, because it leaves open the question of which other students passed the exam. Whereas these other propositions, like nobody passed the exam and only Alice and Bob passed the exam, they do resolve the question because they pin down the set of students who passed. Right? So it's not clear to us really what the criteria are in these theories to be considered a possible answer. And that we think is a bit of a problem also in terms of assessing the predictions of these theories, because so suppose that a theory of questions delivers a certain set of propositions as possible answers. Well, how can we tell if this prediction is correct? We need some kind of pre-theoretical grasp of what this means. And so we think that this notion of the question being resolved or answered, if you will, it's pre-theoretically just clearer. So if we consider a question like who passed the exam, then it's clear that just the information that Alice passed the exam is not enough to settle this proposition, because there might be other people who also passed the exam, whereas the information that nobody passed the exam, or the information that only Alice and Bob passed the exam, they are sufficient to resolve the question. So we think that it's we have a firmer pre-theoretical grasp of this notion of being answered or resolved than we have of the notion being a basic answer, basically.
Well, if I can add something, depends on Moritz. Well, this seems to presuppose that this particular question is understood in a way which is called "give me all the examples." What about give me some or give me one example? So is the concept of resolution connected with one particular reading of WH questions, or it's more universal?
No, so good question. So this is indeed, so here we have in mind this mention all reading of the WH question. So in inquisitive semantics, it is indeed possible to disambiguate, right? So once you formalize things, you will have two different logical forms that will correspond to the mention all reading of the question and the mention some reading. And each of these readings will be associated with different resolution conditions. So indeed, the proposition Alice passed the exam would be sufficient to resolve the mention some reading of the question, but not the mention all, which is normally more salient one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andre.
Okay, thank you. I now have nobody on the reading list. That means I can pose my question, which is a good thing also. And I have a question about the problems with considering questions as consisting of kind of a force of asking together with some kind of proposition. So you said that's easy with the yes/no questions. Of course, that's at least in one reading, this is easy. And then you presented a couple of problematic cases. But I think to weaken your case a little bit, the other examples that you gave, I think, are akin to examples in declarative logic where you have similar problems. For example, you have in a derivation which works with existential quantification. After you inferred, for example, an existential quantification, you have something like, so let's say the existential statement is something like, there's a P, there's an X such that P. So next you say, let A be such an X, or let A be P, or something like that, right? So you make just an existential instantiation. This is, of course, a supposition, at least judging after let and so on. So if you criticize questions like WH questions for being kind of problematic because they don't include a full proposition, then one has to make a case that in declarative logic that problem doesn't surface, or it does not surface in the same way. And it appears to me one could make the case that this is very similar in existential instantiation if read as a supposition. On the other hand, on the number of examples that you gave, there were a couple of questions missing, which I think are really unproblematic from a point of view of force operator applied to closed formulas, so to say. So, for example, why questions? Why did who was it? John steal the jewels, or I don't know what. Or why will you go to France, for example, or how will you go to France? So there's a lot of questions which actually work with something that we can recognize as a proposition right away. So maybe that problem is not as big as it appears. And sorry, a final point with the alternative question. One could also make a case that actually alternative questions are finite numbers of yes/no questions. So there are ways to deal with that. So how would you respond to that?
Okay, so there are different points here. So the first is, so isn't this parallel to the case where we use like a fresh variable in a derivation, something like this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, but in that case, I wouldn't say that in a derivation, we're really caring about the syntax, right? So we really have constraints like, this is a variable that shouldn't occur in the premises, blah, blah. So it doesn't seem that this is something that's going on at the level of propositions, but just at the level of manipulation of the surface forms, right? And so vice versa. So if let's say that you wanted to associate a proposition to where will you go, what would be the truth conditions of that?
Well, my point is not to say that it's easy to like talk about truth conditions about within questions like WH question or something like that. My point is that it's already problematic in declarative logic, where you have suppositions of things that are not obviously propositions, so to say. So you suppose that A has the property P, and of course this surfaces in a syntactical context in the sense of within a calculus or something like that. But still, it's a kind of a supposition that one makes, isn't it? But maybe that's too much. I'm trying to push a point on you, which is maybe not fair.
Yeah, no, I need to think about that. No, so it's a good point. I see this more in the other direction as, let's say, a nice puzzle about how to construe this move of making a supposition with this fresh variable in a proof, right? It seems that also in that case, there is no real proposition that we're supposing. We're just supposing kind of a type of proposition. And
yeah, if you will, yeah.
Yeah, something like this. Yeah. And maybe whatever will work as a solution there will work here, but I think it will require a kind of shift from just real propositions to something more fine-grained.
Yes. And on the other hand,
there were other points. So about this alternative question, isn't that just what did you say? A conjunction of polar questions? Or?
I wouldn't say conjunction. I said a number of yes/no questions. So just consecutively posed. So it's like a sequence of multiple speech acts, and each speech act being a yes/no question. And you have, in this case that you just displayed, it's like 3 yes/no questions.
So in that case, you would think that so if it's a sequence of 3 yes/no questions, you would expect to have something like 8 ways to resolve it, right? But actually, I think
you have I mean, the point is that then it's the problematic case. Sorry, the unproblematic case. The yes/no questions are unproblematic. That's I think what you pointed out at the beginning of the slide.
The effect of using an alternative question is not the same effect as the effect of asking a sequence of 3 polar questions, right? Because the alternative question kind of presupposes that these three possibilities are exhaustive and exclusive, and it asks for a choice between them. So you have like a threefold choice plus a certain presupposition that these are related in a certain way, whereas the 3 polar questions would give then 8 choices without any presupposition, right? So you would get a different effect.
So you would say that, yeah, I agree that this is the way to model it in inquisitive semantics, but that also means that I will go to neither in response to question B is not an answer.
That's right. So it's not a resolution of the question, but rather it's denial of the presupposition of the question.
All right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
It's a kind of it's not really a compliant move, but in a way it's a challenging move, right? It's a move that says, okay, you're assuming something wrong here.
Yes.
So it has a different status.
Yeah. And then, since nobody is intervening, I would still ask another question about the supposition of questions. So in the Ramsey test, you chose an example where the antecedent of a conditional is a proposition, so to say, or expresses a proposition. But if I'm correct, it could also be a question. So that means that yeah, wait a second. I think we are almost there. Oh yeah, the YouTube audience now can only see me, but not. But anyway, we will see it in a second. So if the antecedent is a question in itself or expresses a question, then the Ramsey test would would require that one supposes a question, right?
Right. Yes.
So it appeared that in an earlier slide, it's kind of you have certain speech acts that are that apply to propositions and other that apply to issues, but they don't mix. But maybe I missed something. So would you say that there's like a real distinction between certain speech acts that are only for propositions and others that are only for questions or issues, or would you say that basically all can apply to all forces, all illusionary forces can apply to all propositions and issues, basically?
No, this is a great question. So I think, yeah, this is indeed a subtle point, and I think here's a point where there's a distinction between whether we're doing semantics of natural language or whether we are just developing formal languages to regiment thought. So in natural language, if you have an if conditional, then you cannot have an interrogative under the if clause, right? So you can only have an interrogative in the consequent part, but not really in the antecedent part. So let's say from the point of view of natural language, this covers the general case of an if conditional, right? However, from the point of view of a formal language, so it's true, you could have, so you could ask whether it makes sense to have something like a supposition of an arbitrary inquisitive proposition that might be expressed by a question. And the answer is yes, that would make sense. And so you could also, so maybe I should also say something about what sense it would make. And this could also be illustrated by this proof that I've shown, right? At some point I had this proof. And here you have an assumption in the proof, which is a question. right? So this is a kind of supposition that you're making, and the question that you're supposing is which objects are P. Now, what does that mean? Now, the approach does give an answer to that. It says, when you suppose which objects are P, you're supposing to have the information which objects are P, right? You're supposing to have some specification of what the extension of P is, but you're not saying in the proof which exact specification you're given.
Yes.
So it's a kind of non-deterministic assumption, right? You're supposing to have some type of information rather than some specific information. And then what you conclude is you conclude that assuming that you have this type of information, you also have another type of information, namely which objects are Q, which means you have the information what the extension of Q is, right? So we do indeed get an extension of, let's say, the standard moves of making a supposition and drawing a conclusion that can be applied to questions as well. And I think it makes sense to use these things freely if we just want to have nice languages that we understand well to formulate these reasonings. But I also agree that the situation is different in natural language in the sense that there you don't really say things like suppose whether P or something like this. So it might be interesting to have a better explanation for why natural language doesn't allow these kind of moves. But yeah, that's not something that I have at this point.
Yes, thank you. Maybe it's just a case of vacuous quantification, which doesn't exist in natural language either. So, but anyway, that's just an idea. We have two speakers, two askers, and one is Flores. Please go ahead.
Hey, so I was wondering, so you mentioned a couple of phenomena in which question contents play a role, and then you had this at least. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what you had in mind as other areas where question contents would play a role.
For one thing, it was more like just a cautionary, at least, meaning that I don't have any reason to suspect that these are all the roles.
Okay.
So it's just, I'm not asserting these are their roles, just these are some roles. But one extra role that one could have in mind indeed is what you investigated quite a bit, which is also the way that question meanings play a role in licensing anaphoras, right? And play a role in allowing to understand subsequent utterances. And then, I don't have to tell you this, but of course, this is the kind of thing that would require a more dynamic take on the semantics of questions, just like phenomena to deal with anaphora among statements are normally taken to motivate a more dynamic take than truth conditions on the semantics of statements. So
okay, so I was not thinking in that direction actually. So I was thinking maybe you had in mind things like making decisions or revising beliefs, where so in modeling decision making or belief revision, people have suggested that questions play a role, but not many actual theories take that into account. And perhaps so this is something that also we have never like seriously explored, I think, in inquisitive semantics, but it may be something that's interesting to discuss as the workshop goes.
Sorry, what is exactly the role that you have in mind there?
So in making decisions, so you evidently that you're guided by your desires and your beliefs, and that's what most theories take as the main parameters that guide a decision. But yeah, it's natural to think, I think, that these are not all the parameters, that the questions that you entertain are also guiding the decision in some cases. And Daniel Hook has a dissertation recently at NYU, I think, bringing this parameter into the theory of making decisions. And so I think that would be a very interesting area. And then belief revision is more the Olson and Westlund type of idea that if you want to think about what would be a rational way of revising your beliefs in the face of new information, it's also not just your old beliefs and the new information and some most theories take as the main parameter some graded notion of entrenchment or some of your beliefs, but it's also the questions that you entertain. So these are other areas that I would think are nice.
Yeah, so these are indeed natural places where you would think that questions play a role. I think that in terms of my categorization of the roles of question meanings, it can be subsumed under this role 3. So here, my general point was that these issues play a role in our mental life, right? And here I just illustrated this with some ascriptions. Okay, you can be curious about that, etc. But then, of course, you can say something more about what role they play in our mental life, right? For instance, when they play a role of decision problems, they play a role of the kind of things that we have in our research agenda, which grow or decrease in importance according to what we learn. They play a role in making certain propositions more salient, which are congruent to the questions that you entertain, right? So I think that this is indeed bringing out in a way more fully this point, right? That these are also important cognitive objects of thought, and they play a role in a lot of mental processes like deliberation and planning.
Yeah.
All right. I think that now my clock just switched to 8 p.m. So everybody who's in a different time zone will probably have something else. But we are at the end of the talk, and I think it was really an interesting talk with an interesting discussion from already a number of different points of views. And I think that's what important about this conference, at least that's what I wish to be important. So we will now, in a matter of a minute, terminate the stream. But first, let me thank everybody for the participation. Let's thank Ivano for his talk and for the discussion, as well as all the discussion participants. Again, if some of the viewers at YouTube want to participate in the conference, please write an email to me. You can find it on the conference website. And I think we have still a little bit room for like 2 or 3 more persons. So for now, goodbye to all the YouTube viewers. Hope to see you somewhere else soon, or some of the YouTube viewers are maybe already participants. So goodbye, see you. For the others, please stay within the in the Jitsi room.